Your Excellency, President S.R. Nathan, NUS Chancellor, the Right Honourable Lord Patton of Barnes, Chancellor of Oxford University, and Lady Patton, Your Excellency Paul Madden, British High Commissioner to Singapore, NUS Pro-Chancellors, members of the NUS Board of Trustees, Professor Tan Cho Chuan, NUS President, and Dr. Evelyn Lee, Professor Wang GungWu, University Professor and Chairman of the East Asian Institute, and Mrs. Margaret Wang. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Norlin Samad from the Office of Corporate Relations, and I'm your Master of Ceremonies for this event. Before we serve brunch, may I invite NUS President, Professor Tan Cho Chuan, to say a few words, please. Prof. Tan, please.
Your Excellency, President S.R. Nathan, NUS Chancellor, the Right Honourable Lord Patton of Barnes, Chancellor of Oxford University, and Lady Patton, Your Excellency Paul Madden, the British High Commissioner to Singapore, NUS Pro-Chancellors, members of the NUS Board of Trustees, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a very warm welcome to this very special occasion. It is a great honour for the National University of Singapore to welcome to our campus one of our most distinguished visitors, the Right Honourable Lord Patton. Thank you, Lord and Lady Patton, for spending time with us so kindly, despite your very hectic schedule in Singapore. I would also like to express our deep gratitude to NUS Chancellor, President S.R. Nathan, for graciously agreeing to host this brunch. Lord Patton's long and distinguished career in public service and international relations is well known. One of Europe's most distinguished statesmen, Lord Patton was elected to the British Parliament in 1979. From 1999 to 2004, he served as European Union's Commissioner for External Relations. He also held cabinet positions, was chairman of Britain's Conservative Party, and the last British governor of Hong Kong, overseeing its return to China in 1997. A visionary who has infused his diverse roles with unmatched passion and distinction, Lord Patton has also been serving since 2003 as a Chancellor of Oxford University, one of the preeminent centres of learning, teaching and scholarship in the world, and the first university to be established in the English-speaking world some 9 centuries ago. NUS and Oxford University enjoy warm and close ties, a relationship that we have had the privilege of building over the years. As fellow members of the International Alliance of Research Universities, both NUS and Oxford also share a commitment to global interactions as a key strategy for our universities in the 21st century. The International Alliance of Research Universities initiatives such as the Global Summer Program and the Global Internship Program are providing valuable opportunities for students from our 2 universities to learn together, to engage one another, and to gain a more direct sense of globalization and its implications. These initiatives build on the firm and extensive foundation of faculty exchanges and research collaborations that already exist between our universities and which continue to grow. We are thus extremely privileged that despite a short stay in Singapore, Lord Patton has made time to visit our university and to share with us his wealth of experience and deep insights on Europe, China, and India in the dialogue session after this brunch. So on this note, let me once again welcome you warmly to this brunch in honor of Lord and Lady Patton and to wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Tan. Ladies and gentlemen, brunch is served. Bon appetit. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed brunch and are now ready for our dialogue with Lord Patton. There are 2 parts to the discussion this afternoon. Prof. Wang and Lord Patton will first make some brief remarks. This will be followed by the dialogue proper, during which Prof. Wang will be inviting questions from the floor for Lord Patten. My colleagues are on hand with microphones for the Q&A portion of the program. To start things off, may I invite Prof. Wang to make some brief introductory remarks, please. Prof. Wang, please.
Lord and Lady Patton, President Tan Cho Chuan and Dr. Evelyn Lee, Pro-Vice Chancellors, and members of the Board of Trustees, colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to this special dialogue with Lord Patton, Chancellor of the University of Oxford. And I have to say, Lord Patton was my Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong when I was there as Vice Chancellor. Now, this is from 1992 to my retirement at the end of 1995. So I can say that Lord Patton has done this before, being Chancellor. He knows how to do it. In fact, I can even claim that he cut his teeth on the University of Hong Kong before going to Oxford. We have met several times after that, each time when Lord Patton had yet another responsible position thrust upon him, and also has written another book. So I asked him what is his next book, and he's thinking hard about it. I know he will come out with something again very well worth reading. So it gives me great pleasure to reconnect with him and to have the honor to introduce him today. Lord Patton is a highly regarded political figure, as we all know, also a public intellectual and a skilled diplomat. We are privileged to have him speak to us this afternoon on the topic, Europe and the rise of China and India. It is an area that Lord Patton is eminently qualified to speak on, given his wealth of experience spanning 4 decades in Europe and Asia. He served as Member of Parliament in the British government for over a decade. He took on many leadership roles, handling diverse portfolios such as education, overseas development, and the environment. I think he's particularly proud of his time in charge of the environment. He refers to it frequently, and it is so timely today. In 1992, Lord Patton was appointed Governor of Hong Kong, a position he held to 1997, overseeing the return of Hong Kong to China. On his 5-year term in Hong Kong, Lord Patton described the experience as having, more than anything else in his life, affected his views, both his views on political life and his views on leadership. He also attributed his Hong Kong experience as having shaped him for the rest of his life. Lord Patton went on to become the European Commissioner for External Relations between 1999 and 2004, overseeing many crises in the area of European foreign policy. Today, in the area of international diplomacy, Lord Patton serves as chair for the British Council in the United Kingdom, Italy Conference. He's also co-chair of the International Crisis Group and the UK-India Roundtable, a high-level initiative committed to growing and strengthening ties between the United Kingdom and India. With his decades of experience as a politician, Lord Patton has become a sought-after expert offering a unique and invaluable insider's perspective on Europe and Asia. Drawing on his keen understanding of East and West and his first-hand experience and perspectives in shaping public policies, Lord Patton has authored a number of best-selling books on politics and diplomacy. They include What Next? Surviving the 21st Century, published in 2008, Not Quite the Diplomat, Home Truths About World Affairs, published in 2005, and East and West, China, Power, and the Future of Asia, published in 1998, on Asia and its relations with the rest of the world. Please join me now in inviting the Right Honourable Lord Chris Patten of Barnes to share his perspectives and experiences on Europe and the rise of China and India.
President, Professor Wang, High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, can I say what a very great pleasure it is to be asked to talk to you this lunchtime and to visit the National University of Singapore for the first time. It's not the first time I've addressed academic audiences, or largely academic audiences in Singapore, but it's the first time that I've done so on this spectacular campus. I'm particularly pleased to be here because the NUS is one of our colleague universities in the International Alliance of Research Universities, and we're pleased with the research collaboration that we already have with NUS. We very much hope we'll be able to build on that in the years ahead. And one of my ambitions as Chancellor is to outstrip Cambridge in the number of students we manage to attract to Oxford. Singaporean students have a spectacular record at Oxford. 3 of them got the highest marks in their subjects this year, including one from a well-known Singapore family who did better than anybody else in economics at my old college. So we very much hope that that will set a trend and encourage more young Singaporeans to come and study with us and work with us at Oxford. I always think that a country which sends so many brilliant young people abroad to study is doing the university system around the world a very good turn. So thank you very much indeed. I'm also delighted to be reunited with Professor Wang. We've met a good deal over the years on occasions like this, but as you said, Professor, our principal relationship was when I was the last colonial oppressor in the British Empire, and Professor was Vice-Chancellor of Hong Kong U, one of 2 Hong Kong universities now reckoned to be in the world's top 50, which is an extraordinary record for a community of Hong Kong's size, and a great tribute to the leadership which you gave, Professor, at a particularly sensitive time. I just say sometimes in a sort of provocative way to my European colleagues that when you look at those international league tables, one recalls that it was German universities, the Humboldt University model in the 19th century, which was taken to the United States as the model for their great research institutions, MIT, Stanford, and so on. The highest placed German university in league tables now comes in at number 55. So Hong Kong has a lot to teach Europe, and Singapore has a lot to teach Europe. So I'm particularly pleased to be here. I noticed that the excellent MC seemed to put some stress on the word brief when she referred to the remarks that you could expect, and it reminds me of the very first time I spoke at a Rotary Club lunch in my constituency, when I said to the president of the Rotary branch on my way into lunch, "How long would you like me to speak for?" And he replied, well, he said, "You go on as long as you like, but we all leave at 2:15. So I will indeed be brief. I also have to underline the point, which I'm sure will become more evident as this lunch session goes on, that I'm not, of course, a serious academic. The Chancellor of Oxford University is elected, and elected like the Pope or the Dalai Lama for life. And when people say, how long is your term of office? When do you step down? I always say, well, if you can tell me when my memorial service is, you just come back a couple of months before that, and you've got it accurately. My job was described by my predecessor, but one, Harold Macmillan, who was Chancellor for many years, Chancellor indeed when I was an undergraduate. He was once asked what the Chancellor of Oxford University did, and he replied rather metaphysically by saying, well, as you know, he says, the Vice-Chancellor, President, the Vice-Chancellor actually runs the university, but if you didn't have a Chancellor, you couldn't have a Vice-Chancellor. And my own immediate predecessor, Lord Jenkins, described the job very accurately as one in which impotence was assuaged by magnificence. So here I am, elected but impotent, a sort of democratic eunuch, and a member of the House of Lords, which, as some of you will also know, is proof of the existence of life after death. Let me come briefly to the subject of our dialogue today. Nothing, I should think, should detract from our admiration in Europe and North America for what has happened over the last generation in China and India, or what began to happen earlier than that in Japan, and then the tiger economies of East and Southeast Asia, including, of course, Singapore. What's happened in Asia has transformed the quality of life for hundreds of millions, billions of people, and what's been good for Asia is good for the rest of the world. I just want to mention telegrammatically 4 things. First of all, the historical context for what's happened. Secondly, I'd like to suggest that we shouldn't perhaps, Asians shouldn't perhaps be too hubristic about what's happened, and perhaps others shouldn't be too extravagant in their praise or prediction. Thirdly, I'd like to make 1 or 2 explicit points about China and India. And fourthly, I'd like to consider what I think are the central issues of global politics which arise from what has happened, particularly with the re-emergence of China and India. And that's the first point which I want to touch on, which is the context. It is the re-emergence. People sometimes write about what's happened in Asia as though before 1978-79 in China or 1990 in India, there wasn't any history. We all know that as the largest countries in the world, China and India have dominated global output and the global economy for 18 out of the last 20 centuries. The best guide to that is the greatest, I think, of all economic historians who died recently, Angus Maddison, whose figures on GDP growth and output tell the story of the millennia. From 1500 onwards, admittedly, GDP per capita in Europe was outstripping China and India. But because of their size, until 1820, China and India commanded about 50% of world output. That fell very steeply from 1820 to the 1970s. It fell from 50%, about 33% China, 16 or 17% India, to 8% by the last 25, 30 years of the 20th century. And to some extent, it's more surprising that that fall was so steep than that the recovery, that the ascent has been so swift and spectacular. The reasons for the steep decline are partly colonialism. Listen to an Indian economist well disposed towards my own country like Manmohan Singh talk about the consequences of colonialism for the Indian economy. Partly a consequence in China, both of the marauding instincts of the colonial powers in the 19th century. Britain itself globalized the Chinese economy by forcing the Chinese to smoke opium at gunpoint. And that was, of course, followed by the civil wars in China, by the Japanese invasion, and by the manic policies pursued by Chairman Mao. The results were pretty catastrophic. And then the turnaround began in China by Deng Xiaoping. When I first visited China in 1979, I said the other day, I remember going up to the border in Luowu in Hong Kong and looking across at Shenzhen, which was then a sleepy fishing village. In 1978-79, China exported in a year what it exports today in a day. India, the turnaround began with the dismantling of the license Raj to a very limited extent in the 1980s, but much more rapid in the 1990s in response to a foreign exchange crisis. And I'm pleased to say that two Oxford-educated economists, well, one of them was also at Cambridge for a bit, played a prominent role in that. Dr. Manmohan Singh and Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who is certainly, I think, one of the greatest economists in the world. So today, China is the second largest economy in the world. It will be the largest economy in the world before the middle of the century. It's the largest exporter and it's the largest consumer of energy. I think what's happened in Asia shouldn't encourage people to write off Europe or America. America can speak for itself pretty loudly. America, as I said in a lecture which bore Dr. Lee's name, America is the only country that matters everywhere. Julian Barnes, the English novelist, makes a very good point about America's relations with the rest of us. He says, if you want to see your own country disappear before your eyes, you go to America and you open an American newspaper. America, with never more than 5% of the world's population, has been responsible for between 20 and 30% of world output for 125, 130 years. Europe shouldn't be written off. Europe has 7% of the world's population and about 22% of world output. That's higher than America. It's about twice as high as China and between 4 and 5 times as high as India. So even though Europe has a stuttering growth rate, a falling share, a falling population, particularly, perhaps paradoxically, in the most Catholic countries, and is threatened, therefore, with a falling share of world trade and world output. It starts from a pretty good position, and Europe's real problem is its reluctance to accept that in order to retain its present quality of life, it has to make some rather uncomfortable changes in the way it manages, particularly its welfare state. I think just to put the predictions and the hubris in context, it's worth remembering when you read some of the gee-whiz predictions about China today, it's worth recalling that in the 1980s, 6 of the world's largest banks by capital value were Japanese, and Sumitomo took over and saved a chunk of Goldman Sachs. That was the 1980s. It's also worth perhaps recalling that Asia's total share of world GDP at market exchange rates actually slipped from 29% in 1995 to 27% by 2009. And while Asia has 3/5 of the world's population, it only has about 1/5 of global consumption. The United States is responsible alone for 30% of global consumption. Nevertheless, the turnaround in Asia has been spectacular and is probably the largest reason for being optimistic about the 21st century. Very briefly, how do Europeans in particular see the emergence of China and India? I think the simple answer is with considerable enthusiasm. I've just been with the British Prime Minister on a visit to India, mainly directed towards our economic as well as our political ties, with a Prime Minister who recognizes that today India invests more in Britain than Britain invests in India, a Prime Minister who recognizes the extraordinary growth opportunities represented by the increasing size of the Indian middle class. Prime Minister is probably going to China later on in the year for similar reasons. I think that it's interesting that the rise of China and India and the economic advantages they have in a number of industrial sectors. For example, 50% of the world's, and therefore this room's, silk ties are made in China. 20 years ago, you'd have looked on the back of a silk tie and it would have been certainly made in Italy. The Italian silk tie industry, it's not the most important thing that Europe has exported to China, but the Italian silk tie industry has been pretty well wiped out. And it's perhaps surprising that there hasn't been more protectionist sentiment in response to that. One reason, of course, is the number of European multinationals which have set up shops, set up manufacturing capacity in Asia. And one reason for the trade imbalance with Asia in most European countries is that Europe-based companies are exporting back to Europe things which are now made there rather than in European factories. I think one thing that could change in relation, however, to the free trading environment is if China in particular is reluctant to face up to the consequences of its growing economic strength, and in particular to the consequences of the imbalance represented by the fact that from 2000 to 2007, half the world's prodigious growth was Chinese exports and the American deficit. That's an imbalance which can't continue, which is why there is so much emphasis placed by, and increasingly by, American congressmen and even some European politicians on the manipulation of the renminbi. I think it would be a grave miscalculation on the part of the Chinese authorities if they didn't recognize that sooner rather than later. What are the political consequences, finally, of the transformation of China and India? Well, one very obvious one is that the institutions of global governance, which were established under American leadership in the 1940s and which reflect the world balance of power at the end of the war, the UN, Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions, those institutions of global governance no longer reflect today's political balance. And I think one problem which I would be pretty concerned about if I was a Singaporean politician or technocrat is that what is replacing the authority and legitimacy of the UN and its institutions is ad hoc multilateralism, with, for example, the G8 morphing into the G20, which represents the biggest countries but leaves the smaller countries to fend for themselves. And I think that will probably drive some smaller countries into greater regional cooperation. I very much hope that's the case. But it also doesn't seem to me that it's a very legitimate form of global governance. And I hope that we don't simply give up on the reform of the UN and Bretton Woods institutions. One very important thing that the European Union should do the next time that senior posts come up at the World Bank and the IMF is to push Asian candidates for those posts rather than to insist on them being taken by Europeans or North Americans. Somebody like Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia would be a terrific candidate, for example, for Managing Director of the IMF next time that post comes up, which has been claimed by Europeans since time immemorial, or at least since the 1940s. The other point I just want to make about the politics of what has happened with the re-emergence of China and India as great economic powers, alongside perhaps Brazil. I'm not sure I'd put, unlike Goldman Sachs, Russia in that category. Russia can cause trouble, but I'm not sure it can do very much good. One other consequence is it's a reminder that no countries, certainly not the United States or China, that no country, however powerful, can deal with global problems on its own. I think that the Americans learned that lesson the hard way under the last president. But it's true not just in areas where a military solution may be thought desirable. Whether you're talking about climate change or the drugs trade or nuclear proliferation or epidemic disease, whether you're talking about global imbalances and trade, whichever area you're talking about, in order to deal with global problems, we need regional and global solutions. That's not least relevant to a fact which I'm not sure we've sufficiently addressed, namely that the real threats to peace these days don't come from strong countries, but for the first time in global history come from weak countries, come from countries where the institutions of government have largely withered away. We, I guess, can see the consequences of weak states in Somalia, in Afghanistan, Burma, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, but should, I think, be more concerned today about the consequences of the destruction of governance in Pakistan and the destruction of governance in Mexico by drugs. I think the situation in Mexico is far more worrying for the United States in many respects than the situation in Afghanistan, but it's not addressed in that way. So, despite the fact that nation states remain the principal building blocks in international society, because of the porous nature of the boundaries of nation states in an increasingly intimately globalized world, we do need to work together in order to deal with global problems, and that is easier said than done. I hope not too long, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
The understanding of what Europe is still fairly new in Asia. Most of us in Asia, through the last 100-odd years or so, dealt with individual countries which are very powerful. And it is still relatively hard for us to grasp what Europe actually stands for. We know what it stands for Europe, but what it stands for outside of Europe is still very unclear, because even when the European countries are represented out here, they're still represented by their countries more than by the idea of Europe. So for China and rising at this time, I'm not sure they understand what Europe means. India has its own special relationship with Britain, and most Indians have a good grasp of what different European countries do. The Chinese actually have very little experience of Europe. They, most of the time, actually, they look to America. Much of their higher education, their economic and military experiences have been, in recent times anyway, with the United States. And I find that, on the whole, Chinese leaders have a very vague notion of what Europe stands for. So if I may put the stress on the Europe part, how would you, and now you come to Asia often, to India and China, how would you want the Chinese and the Indians and other Asians to understand Europe's future in this part of the world?
The construction of the European Union is unique, and in describing it, one is sometimes trapped between the rhetoric of the 1940s and 50s and the reality of today. A great friend and colleague of mine, who was Prime Minister of Italy, Giuliano Amato, describes the European Union as being like an unidentified flying object, which you sort of know where it may be coming from. You've no idea where it's going, but it's an exciting ride. It's a very happy metaphor, but I'm not sure it's quite sufficient to answer your question. The European Union is not a superstate in the making. The European Union is a collection of nation states which, with considerable American encouragement, have agreed to share sovereignty in limited, defined areas in order to become more economically relevant and less politically dangerous. After the war, the Americans were happy to stay on in Europe to help protect Western Europe against the threat of Soviet communism. But they weren't prepared to do so if there was a danger of Europe tumbling back into xenophobic nationalism, into the sort of European civil war which we'd seen after 1914-18. And in a way, the price that Europe paid more or less happily for NATO was to make greater progress in the European integration. The prospect of European integration was always more happily received in Washington than in the United Kingdom. And you should never forget that the most important reason for the establishment of the European Union was to prevent another European war. Lashing together France and Germany at the heart of the enterprise, sharing their economic wealth, coal and steel community, for example, in a way which would make it difficult for them to fight one another again. What's happened in terms of economic integration since then is extraordinary. The creation of a single trade policy, of a single market, a single environment policy. And in all those areas, China and India have learnt that they have to deal with Europe as one. You negotiate with European countries on trade as the EU. You negotiate with, at Copenhagen, on environmental policy with Europe as one. You negotiate on competition policy or regulatory issues with Europe as one. It's much more difficult when you look at the political side of things, the political arena. Because Europeans understand rationally that as medium-sized or small countries, we matter much more around the world when we can work together. But foreign and security policy go right to the heart of what it means to be a nation state. And therefore, it's incredibly difficult for us to operate a really tough and effective concerted foreign and security policy. Our foreign policy is what I think is called politely work in progress. It invariably consists of communiques in which there are very strong adjectives and nouns and rather weak verbs. Now, how should the Chinese and Indians react to that? I think the Chinese in particular understand the extent to which the European Union is an economic construct. I think that when I was a commissioner, I used to feel sometimes that the Chinese had a more ambitious view of Europe than Europeans had. It fitted their notion of a multipolar world. I think Europe might have disappointed them by not being so coordinated in foreign policy issues. Nevertheless, I think that China has developed a keen sense of where it has to negotiate with Europe as Europe and where it still has to deal with individual member states. India, I think, has had more difficulty in understanding the economic profile of Europe and distinguishing between what can be done at the European level or should be done and what should be done nationally. What I've said is all said by somebody who believes strongly in my own country's membership of the European Union. And what I've said would be regarded by some other Europeans as a sort of treasonous admission of European weakness. But what I've said, I think, describes the reality of what Europe is like today. I would like it if Europe was more capable of working collectively in the political arena. I would like it if Europe was more able to connect its international political aspirations with what it was able to deliver. But I'm a realist, and I think that you make things more difficult for yourself if you describe yourself in ways which are so distant from what you're actually capable of doing.
Thank you. I now open question. Yes, please. Over there. We need a mic over there.
Thank you, Lord Patton, for your interesting observations and including the advice that we should not fall into hubris, which I take very seriously. What I want to ask was to actually have you reflect, to extend the reflections that you have just made on the question of the role of the nation state, the changing role of the nation state, not simply with regard to regionalization and globalization and different patterns of regionalization. I think Asia is also seeing a certain pattern, but also in terms of the need for nations to have to give up some of their sovereignty for collective public goods, in particular the environment. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
I think it's the most interesting question in political theory these days. I still think that people feel the greatest sense of identity with the institutions and ethos of the nation state, even while they understand very often instinctively or rationally that nation states can't deliver the common goods which they recognize are in their own interest. They understand, I think, the importance of establishing regional or global organizations to try to manage areas where sovereignty needs to be shared in order to cope. But they have difficulty identifying with the institutions which are established to manage shared sovereignty in the way they identify with the institutions of their own national community. So, for example, in Europe, the European Commission is regularly pilloried as something which lacks democratic legitimacy. In America, the UN in New York, the UN plays the same role as Brussels and the European Community plays in Europe. And I think identifying that democratic legitimacy gap, or that gap in authority, is perhaps the first thing we have to do in order to address it. But it is incredibly difficult. And when you look at the amount of intervention in national domestic policy which is required in order to create a credible global response to climate change, it makes you realize how awfully difficult the diplomacy is. Much more difficult than negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. One of my colleagues at Oxford, Margaret Macmillan, has written a brilliant book about the Treaty of Versailles called The Peacemakers. And I said to her the other day, you know, Copenhagen was much more difficult than Versailles. And I'm not sure that's sufficiently recognized. You think what you're asking people to do in order to have a successful global policy on climate change, you're first of all telling Indians and Chinese and Singaporeans that they can't live in the future like Europeans and North Americans and Australians have been happy to live for the last 50 or 100 years. You're telling Americans and Europeans, though I think Europeans get this, I don't think Americans, Canadians and Australians yet get it really. You're telling them that it's no good talking about national aggregate figures when you start to negotiate. You have to recognize per capita figures. Australians and Canadians and Americans and Europeans have to realize that since we're more responsible than emerging economies for the problems up there, we have to do more faster than emerging and developing economies do. But we're also saying to emerging and developing economies who want the same standard of living and quality of life of the United States or Europe, we're telling them that they too have to take pretty decisive action, because the consequences for them, if they don't, are probably more severe than for America and Europe. So it's incredibly complicated. We did it I chaired the London Conference on the Montreal Protocol in 1990, which led to the banning of the production and use of ozone-depleting substances, of halons and chlorofluorocarbons. And the principles there of the developed countries moving first, of technology transfer, but of everybody at the end of the day being signed up to the same objectives, those are the principles that we will have to apply sometime to carbon dioxide emissions, which have gone up 17-fold over the last century. But it's much more difficult and complicated doing it with carbon than it was with CFCs. It's particularly difficult because of the political situations in China and the United States. In the United States, I don't see how America is going to make any real progress unless it accepts that there has to be a proper price for carbon. And can we believe in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, the Senate and House of Representatives are going to vote for that? In China, we're coming up to a transition of leadership, and can we really believe that any of the candidates for the leadership are going to take an unpopular position on the renminbi and what would be probably an unpopular position on carbon, which would suggest China limiting its growth in the manufactured sector? Hugely difficult problems, but at the end of the day, as clergymen say, unless we address them, the future for our children and grandchildren is going to be pretty bleak.
That was Professor Prasenjit, responsible for research in the social sciences and humanities in the NUS. The next question comes from, could you introduce yourself, please, when you speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord Patton, yes. I'm Dayan Jayatilaka, currently visiting Senior Research Fellow at the ISAS, and until late last year, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva. I'd like to take you up on the fourth point you made in your presentation of the resonance of this phenomenon in the arena of global governance, the United Nations.
Yeah.
And also twin it with the point you made about the political theory and the issue of sovereignty. It was striking that last year, less than 10 days after the Sri Lankan war was over, Europe made a diplomatic move in the UN Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka, which did not entail any consultation either with India or China, and in fact went against the known wishes of China and India, which of course made my job easier, but I was puzzled. Surely, given what you've said and the rise of India and China, Europe should not make any unilateral moves on matters Asian if there is strong objection from these two, and certainly in the case of Sri Lanka, not even Japan voted with Europe. My ancillary question is that shouldn't Europe be more mindful of the different perception of issues of state sovereignty that one finds the further east one goes, certainly in Asia, but perhaps also Eurasia? Thank you.
Well, on the first point, I think the European position, with which I sympathize, was very much related to the circumstances in which the welcome defeat of the LTTE took place. And I have to say, speaking for myself, that I think to a considerable extent that the way the conflict ended is almost certainly likely to produce another conflict in the future. And I don't think it was unreasonable for Europeans to make that point. Now, it may be that they weren't going to get anywhere unless they were able to carry India and China with them, let alone the United States, which was principally concerned, I think, not by what was happening in eastern Sri Lanka, but what was happening between China and Sri Lanka, with the establishment of a new naval base, which has some consequences for India as well. You may be right in saying you won't get anywhere with any initiative in Asia unless you carry China and India with you. But that's not to say that it's not reasonable to make the effort. There's a much bigger issue which is going to affect China and India, on which Europe has a strong position, and that is the question of nuclear proliferation and North Korea and Iran. Sometimes I have the impression when talking to Chinese diplomats or others, Indians try to keep their head down on the issue, that they think that what's happening in Iran and what's happening in North Korea is a ridiculous Western obsession. Well, in my view, Asian and Central Asian countries have a lot more to lose if Iran becomes a nuclear power, if North Korea develops even more nuclear capacity than the West has. You wait until Saudi Arabia and Turkey decide they want to develop nuclear weapons, and who else besides? The question of different attitudes to national sovereignty is a particularly awkward and sensitive one. It raises, of course, the question of the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and it raises much more centrally the whole issue which the UN as a whole voted for in 2004, the principle of the responsibility to protect. Ever since 2004, having voted for it, it seems to me that many member states of the UN, including Asian member states, have developed what estate agents call buyer's remorse. The responsibility to protect is an attempt to establish an international law that it's not just states that have rights, but individuals within states, and that if a state is serially abusing the rights of its citizens, then there is an obligation on the rest of the international community to intervene, not necessarily militarily, but diplomatically and economically first. I think that responsibility to protect in a world in which, as I said earlier, most of the danger comes from weak and collapsing states, I think responsibility to protect is an extremely important principle, which unfortunately was discredited by the American and British intervention in Iraq, was discredited by the way that first Bernard Kouchner and secondly Prime Minister Blair described it. But it remains, when you look at what happened in the Balkans, when you look at what happened in Rwanda, it seems to me that it's a principle which the international community should be able to stand over. I'm fed up of living in a world in which we say again and again, after some new horror story, never again. Never again is simply opening the door to the next time you say never again. So I think that the notion that national sovereignty is always sacrosanct, that if one African tribe is massacring members of another, you have to stand back and say, oh, they've got their own national anthem, they've got their own national flag, they've got their own national sovereignty, nothing we can do about hundreds of thousands of Hutu or Tutsi being murdered. I think that's not a world which is tolerable. And I hope the international community in the 21st century will find a way of dealing with that.
My name is Si Chapman, a retired ambassador from Foreign Ministry. My question is about trade. You mentioned just now refer to global imbalance and the seemingly reluctant by China and India to play a role commensurate with their growing economic importance. In fact, the Americans have complained the Chinese of keeping the renminbi undervalued and not playing the part in the Doha round, for example. If this continue, do you see would this drive Europe and America towards a greater convergence of global economic interests, for example, by reviving this notion of a transatlantic economic alliance, which has come back in the past from time to time, in order to take on this China to counter China, India, which are not playing the fair part in their economic role? Thank you.
It may indeed encourage Europe and America to look again at the issue of an Atlantic free trade area, which would be a happier outcome than for America in particular to drift towards greater protectionism. The area of an Atlantic the issue of an Atlantic free trade area is, and always has been in my judgment, a bit far-fetched. There's pretty well an Atlantic free trade area as it is. There are a few very limited trade barriers, but they're mostly matters of regulatory authority. And they're very difficult to deal with because in America in particular, the regulators are outside government, subject to all sorts of lobbying, and as we've just seen in the attempt to negotiate an open skies agreement, incredibly complicated. So I used to say to my colleagues when I was a European commissioner, you want to negotiate a free trade area with America, you're welcome to the next 10 years. I mean, get on with it. It won't actually make very much difference. Bilateral agreement, for example, between the competition authorities in America and Europe over monopoly legislation is likelier than an overall agreement in which Europe and North America are in effect the same customs union. You know, if you set out to negotiate that, you could say goodbye to the rest of your career. I think that the likeliest consequence of China not responding to what I think are increasingly legitimate concerns about what Mr. Geithner said, but hasn't said since, when he was giving evidence before his appointment as Treasury Secretary, what he called the manipulation of the renminbi. I think the likely consequence if China doesn't react is that there will be growing protectionist sentiment in the Senate and Congress. And let me put one simple political point to you. In order to get American unemployment back to the figure it was at before the recession of 5%, America has to create 10 million jobs. In order to deal with immigration and demographic growth, to stay at 5%, America would then have to increase employment by 1.5 million jobs a year. So 10 million jobs to get back to where we were before the recession. And then on top of that, 1.5 million a year. And if America in the next 3 or 4 years, with President Obama, for example, suffering a huge setback in the midterm elections, continues to see no adjustment being made in China as far as global imbalances are concerned, and there may be some pressure on Germany as well, then I think it's a pound to a penny that America, to prevent what Lou Dobbs on CNN calls the hollowing out of the American middle class, in order to prevent that, America will become more protectionist. I don't actually think, and I'm not saying that Europe is more moral than or better behaved than America. I don't think there are quite the same pressures in Europe, but that they exist in America seems to me to be absolutely clear. And if you look at it as an economist with any notion of history, the danger is of China behaving like America did in the 1920s. There's always trouble in the world when a new economic power erupts onto the scene. Japan in the 1960s and 70s, manipulating the value of the yen, finishing the fixed exchange rate system. America back in the 20s with policies which led inexorably to the protectionism and the xenophobia of the 20s and 30s. So I'm really quite nervous about us not getting this right. One thing which is for certain, I said in my lecture the other day that if you look at situation from 2000 to 2007, when we had the fastest growth in the world for 40 years and the fastest increase, the largest increase in per capita income ever, 3.2% a year. Half of that was the American deficit and Chinese exports. And that is not sustainable. 2 years out of that period, 3 years out of that period, Walmart was a bigger trade partner of China than either Australia or Russia. Fantastic deflationary boom. But as Herb Stein said, and he was the person I quoted the other day, things that can't go on forever don't. And we can't continue to run the world on that basis. So unless there is very sophisticated appreciation of that and some pretty tough political decisions, Americans have to save more, Chinese have to spend more, British have to save more.
My name is Bo Zhiyue. I'm from EAI. My question is about the EU-China relations. I have, as you know, there are two major, concerns or requests from Chinese government for EU. One of them is recognition of China's market economy status. The other is arms embargo. For the first one, I noticed there are some kind of different voices among member states, as well as EU. And I think, EU, China has been member of WTO for 9 years. And EU has established a strategic partnership with China for 7 years now. And recently, in July 2010, Germany, in a joint communique with China, decided to push for EU to recognize China's market economy status. I'm wondering, maybe 3 different levels. What is the EU's plan for such a recognition? Because I think there's kind of a deadline. By 2016, you will have to automatically recognize China's market economy status by default. And so what is the EU's plan for this? And the second one is, what is UK's stand in this regard? And third, what is your personal take on this issue? Thank you.
Well, let me give you my personal take on the issue first, and then I'll come to the question of the arms embargo. My global take on the issue is I'd be very happy for Europe to be more positive about China's claim for market economy status if China took more seriously some of the European Union's arguments about non-tariff barriers to European trade with China. You go and talk to the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, and they have a list of anxieties as long as their arm, which haven't been addressed. I'd be perfectly happy to negotiate, as it were, tit for tat over market economy status. I think I'm right in saying that ludicrously the European Union gave market economy status to some countries, including Russia, I think, and the Ukraine, which are no more market economies than North Korea is. Well, they're slightly more market economies than North Korea is. But I think these are at the margins, not big issues in determining trade flows. There's a lot of political resonance to them, and I would frankly use it as a straightforward negotiating counter. Why did Germany take a slightly different position to its EU partners? Because German foreign policy is almost entirely now driven by commercial interests, and I'm sure that the German Chancellor or the German Foreign Minister was trying to flog some bit of kit to China. It's one of the reasons why the Chinese frankly don't take Europe as seriously as they should, is because they've found it so easy, and who can blame them, to play off one European country after another in exchange for some alleged trade concession or purchase. I don't blame the Chinese for doing that one moment. If you behave like an idiot, you shouldn't grumble when other people treat you like an idiot. I think China, at the end of the day, does business on entirely the same basis as everybody else. It wants to get the best products at the best price. And Europeans or Americans who convince themselves that there is some political agenda which they have to meet in order to do trade are profoundly foolish. On the arms embargo, was introduced after Tiananmen in order to try to curry favor again over trade deals with the Chinese. President Chirac, who was to cynicism what Frank Sinatra was to crooning, President Chirac, before President Hu Jintao, I think when probably still vice president, and it might have been he'd just become president, when President Hu visited Paris, President Chirac decided that we should do away with the arms embargo, and since Europe was really just an adjunct of French policy, he could announce it. The German Chancellor was also trying to sell some kit, I think trains, to China, went along with this. The rest of the European Union didn't, because they thought that the negotiating position of Europe at the time, that we would give up the arms embargo when China ratified and implemented the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that was still a reasonable bargain. And there was also a recognition that if we, against American advice, started selling arms, high-tech equipment to China, we'd lose American markets, which were much bigger than potential Chinese markets. There isn't much morality about this. Let me say very quickly. There isn't much morality about the American position either, because the Chinese buy reverse engineered technology from Israel, which has got the technology from China in the first place. Remember in 2001, the American surveillance aircraft that was brought down in China was carrying under the wings rockets which were reverse engineered American rockets. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. I would actually like a bit more ethics to enter into it, but if it's all about doing deals, then you need to drive a bargain which is equal to both sides. Do I think that the arms embargo on China has promoted parliamentary democracy in China? Give me a break.
For the past more than 6 decades, Europe lined up with the US in maintaining the global strategic balance and security situation. Now that when this is being challenged, particularly by weaker states, Europe is abandoning the US. What happens when the bigger Asian countries like India and China start asserting for their space in this global security balance? Where will Europe be, with the US or on its own?
I'm not sure it's fair to say that Europe has abandoned the US in security terms. Well, the American position, strongly endorsed by the government of my country on Afghanistan, is to pursue an exit strategy. I have to say that when you're writing to the parents of an 18-year-old who's just been blown up or shot, or when you're visiting an 18 or 19-year-old who's just lost 2 arms and a leg in Afghanistan, it's quite difficult to make heroic the argument that this is all about how we get out of Afghanistan without too much egg on President Karzai or our own face. I think Afghanistan is an appalling story. If we'd been serious about Afghanistan, we should have put more boots on the ground after 2001, but unfortunately and more money on the ground. Unfortunately, the United States by that stage was already focused on the upcoming war in Iraq, and the European members of NATO found it very convenient that the Americans were saying, we don't want to have more soldiers in Afghanistan. We needed more soldiers in Afghanistan then. And what we now find ourselves doing is playing the part of that, of the tourist in that old story of the Irish farmer asked by passengers in a car what the way to Cork was, who replies, I wouldn't start from here. I mean, I think that in Afghanistan, my own country and other European countries like the Dutch have taken a huge number of casualties in a war which is probably more about Pakistan than Afghanistan, and in a war which is going to be very difficult to win in any conventional sense. Iraq was a different matter. It's well known, I suspect, that I was a strong opponent of our involvement in Iraq, which I think was illegal, and I don't think that the invasion of Iraq has made the world a safer place. But your overall question is, will Europe stand by the United States where force is required in order to sustain the international rule of law? I put it in as benevolent a way as I can. Some of Europe will. I think my own country will, and I think some other members of NATO will. Others won't. And let me try to explain that. My parents' generation and my grandparents' generation spent much of their time when they were thinking about international affairs worrying about the bellicosity of Germany and the amount that Germany spent on armaments. Germany is the biggest economy in the European Union. Nowadays in Europe, we spend our time worrying that the Germans don't spend enough on armaments. Now, I think that's a better world. But it's a world which puts question marks over your ability to deploy power in the interests of broader objectives. So Europe is going to be limited in the security role it can play. What will the security role be of the United States? Well, the United States still commands the global commons, land, air, sea, space. It spends probably 50% of the total global spend on high technology military equipment. And the United States is required to play a global security role because a lot of other people won't. Why is the United States so involved in Asia? Because there's never been between Japan and China the sort of historical reconciliation that there was in Europe between France and Germany. I don't know what the future holds for the relationship between Japan and China, between Southeast Asian countries and China in the sea lanes around China, or in the exploration fields around China. I guess that if it comes to the deployment of military force in the area, you'll be able to depend on American aircraft carriers, and maybe, if we can still afford one, a British carrier and a French carrier. But I think it would be better if you were able to sort these issues out yourselves, and I suspect that if America wasn't available, these issues would have been sorted out already. But the short answer to your question is, I think that Europe will continue to line up alongside the United States in most issues, though with increasing doubts in some countries about whether lining up with the United States is really worth body bags when it comes to the point. But let me tell you just one anecdote. In 2001, not long after the election of Kim Dae-jung in South Korea, he went to see President Bush in order to get endorsement of the Sunshine Policy, his attempt at reconciliation with the North. And President Bush, the new administration, turned him down. He'd been encouraged to go by Colin Powell, who thought that it was a very sensible policy. When he gets to Washington, he's completely cold-shouldered by the President and by Vice President Cheney, whom the older members among you may remember. Kim Dae-jung was mortified by what had happened, and he came to Europe and said, could you in Europe make it clear that you support what I'm trying to do in Korea to promote reconciliation and peace and to prevent any conflict? And there was a Swedish presidency at the time. The Swedish Prime Minister was called Gerd Besson, very nice man. And he agrees that we should do what we can to help the South Koreans. So Mr. Besson and your humble servant and I was External Relations Commissioner, and my colleague, the Spanish diplomat Javier Solana, set off for Pyongyang. A very short distance, as you know, from Seoul, but like going from Earth to the moon. And we spent 6.5 hours negotiating with Kim Jong-il, trying to demonstrate that Europe was behind the South Korean policy. And the only question Kim Jong-il wanted to ask us in 6.5 hours was why the Americans didn't like him. And that, for me, was a reminder that whatever Europe can do around the world, and I don't say this with any great pleasure, it would have been much easier if I'd lived as a diplomat and colonial governor in the 19th century. I might have finished up being governor of Singapore, you never know, if I'd been really lucky. The reality is that America's the only superpower. And there we were, trying to be helpful in a rather pretentious way. And all that Kim Jong-il wanted to know was why the Americans were being nasty to him.
We only have time for one last question. Yes, please.
Iftikhar Chaudhry, Institute of South Asian Studies, but in a previous avatar, Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. Lord Patton, you called European Union mainly an economic construct. The great value of the European Union, though, to our minds, was as a propagator of values. In many ways, moral mores that you spoke of. We worked very closely with one of your successors, Benita Ferrero-Waldner of Austria. And there was a tremendous support from the European Union in institution building in Bangladesh. Today we are able to say that it's one of the calmest countries in the region, largely because we have those institutions through which we have been able to marginalize extremist thought and action. That is the comment. The question is on the United Nations. You did speak of, very briefly of UN reform, you touched upon it, and you spoke of the responsibility to protect the principle. Would the United Nations be in a position to carry out such principles or as a responsibility to protect O2P if it were not adequately reformed to reflect the current global political realities, both the United Nations as a structure and the Security Council as an organization? Thank you.
It's extremely difficult to provide the moral legitimacy for international action, particularly military action. It's extremely difficult to provide UN cover for any international military action without a reformed Security Council. And while I can see some possible reforms which would make things better, for example, slightly more constraint on the use of the veto, so that you were only allowed to use the veto when it was demonstrably in your national interest. You'd have to explain to the General Assembly why you'd used your veto. I can see one or two reforms that might happen like that, but I think it's extremely unlikely that we will see any reform which changes, for the time being, the membership of the Council to reflect in permanent membership what's happened in the world. There should be an Indian seat, permanent seat on the Security Council. But will China support that? Will Japan support that? There are very strong arguments that non-Europeans make for there being a European seat on the Security Council rather than British and French seats. But I don't see any political party in Britain or France campaigning on a promise to opt for a European seat rather than British and French seats, even though if you look at what actually happens, it's very difficult to see examples of how, if we were working as Europe, that would actually damage our own national interest on any issue. Why isn't that? Can you have a Brazilian seat, or a South African seat, or a Nigerian seat, or an Egyptian seat, without regional jealousies, other arguments against those things happening? So terribly difficult. But I sympathize with the argument that it's going to be hugely problematic to develop the moral and legal authority of the UN without reform of the Security Council. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but very difficult. On your first point about exporting values and exporting good governance, I'm strongly in favor of that. I mean, I've never believed that there was a contradiction between a more ethical approach to foreign policy and realpolitik. But you have to be careful about how you do it, you have to be coherent in how you do it, and you have to recognize that governance isn't like making instant coffee. You have to be in these things for the long term. But just to give you one example of how not to do it, North America and Europe can't be in favor of democracy everywhere except in the Middle East. You can't regard the Middle East as the great exception. But we know that it's regarded as the great exception for two reasons. First of all, oil, and secondly, because we're so nervous about the consequences of free elections in countries like Egypt and the likelihood of political Islam winning the elections. But if you're not, if you're lecturing Central Asia or other parts of the world on the importance of them developing democratic institutions, and they turn around and say to you, but what about North Africa? What about the Maghreb and Mashreq countries? Then it would be nice if we had a rather better answer. I think that it's inevitable that in the Middle East, men in uniforms will be replaced sooner or later by men with beards. And the only question is how long we try to delay that, because the longer you delay it, the longer the beards are going to be.
Well, Lord Patton, thank you very much indeed for taking us through very complicated areas indeed. I'm glad you think that Europe can be explained, because you have done so, I think, very clearly to us. And I also do realize that both the Indians and the Chinese have made considerable efforts to try and understand what Europe can and cannot do and what it stands for. I suppose the next, in each in their own way, I mean, I think they don't understand Europe in the same ways the Indians and the Chinese do. But the real problem for us in Asia is whether the Indians and the Chinese will get to understand each other.
Yes.
And that seems to be the sort of #1 item on the agenda these days. And so since you're going to China and after that you're going to India, maybe you can help them, through explaining Europe, help them understand the equally complex, perhaps less complex problems that India and China represent. So that's another task I think should be set for you.
Well, if I can just respond very quickly to that, I think one lesson we can offer to the rest of the world is, however boring we may be sometimes, however hypocritical, however much what we say may go well ahead of what we're able to deliver. The rest of the world is much better off now that we argue in what were once smoke-filled rooms rather than shoot one another. I go around the world. I remember in one of the furthest parts of New Zealand, in the South Island, where they made The Lord of the Rings, being in a tiny little New Zealand village, and looking at the war memorial with the names of 24 New Zealand farmers who'd been killed in the first European Civil War in 1914-18. You look at all the Indian and Singaporean and Malaysian names on the Menai Gate in Europe, and you realize how many people were dragged into European civil wars and killed or maimed as a result. And I promise you, you're all much better off. And now we're boring.
We are very relieved to hear that. Thank you very much, Lord Patton. And may I now invite all of you to thank Lord Patton. He's had a very tough program in the last few days here. We worked him very, very hard. Please join me in thanking him. Thank you very much. Delightful.
Thank you, Lord Patton and Prof. Wang, We've come to the end of the dialogue. May I invite Professor Tan Cho Chuan to present a memento from NUS to Lord Patton, please.